Morning, fish keepers. We've done it. We've made it to Friday. Woo! Let's have a coffee to celebrate. How are you, John?
I'm doing very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I can't complain too much. So yeah, we're happy as. As always, we have ourselves a guest sitting in the back room, so we'll bring him on. Good morning.
Good evening to you guys, or good afternoon for me. So,
fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us. It's much appreciated. Do you want to just give us a quick rundown on who you are and what you've kind of done within the aquatics industry quickly?
Well, I'm Stephan Tanner. Obviously, that says on the label. I'm the owner of SwissTropicals and also the owner of Aquatic Media Press, who publishes Zonas and Coral magazines. And I have been, in fish keeping since 1982 or so.
Cool.
And with the exception of a few years when I came from Switzerland to the US, initially I didn't have some tanks, but as it is with this disease called fish keeping, once you got the bug, you can't resist. And so when I decided that I would stay in the US, in no time I built another fish room and eventually ended up with SwissTropicals as some oxymoron title. Switzerland isn't exactly known for tropical climate. But and since 2012, after leaving the university, I focused solely on SwissTropicals, and then in the last 6 years, first with Amazonas and a year ago with Coral magazines, are now dabbling in the publishing industry, which is a totally new, or was 6 years ago, a totally new endeavor. But we're doing reasonably well, so cannot complain.
Fantastic. So what sparked your initial interest in getting into aquariums?
I think it was a little bit of an accident. We, in the late 70s, early 80s, in Switzerland, the dying forest was sort of the big topic. And at that point, I was in, fourth, fifth grade or something. And everybody wanted to do something. And so me and a few friends decided we would dig natural ponds for people with money in the village. And so they paid us to dig ponds and plant them and drop off tadpoles and salamanders and other stuff to populate the whole thing. And so in that endeavor, I put 300 newt larvae in our bathtub, and my parents were like, all right, he needs another place to put animals. And so I ended up with a 1 meter tank as my first aquarium, brand new. I wanted to buy a cheap used one, and my parents was like, no, we don't want to flood the house. So they have always supported it. And from that, over some detours, I went back to the university, studied first zoology, then human genetics, and then eventually ended up in cancer research in the US, and then did a turnaround again, getting out of cancer research, going back into the aquatic hobby.
Mm-hmm.
And today I have a fish room of, 80 or 90 tanks. And by my last count, 185 species of fish, all freshwater.
That's not bad. What fish predominantly are in your fish room?
I've always liked catfish. That was sort of my initial calling. I've always been sort of a basement person, caveman. So I like stuff that hides and doesn't come out.
Mm-hmm.
And but I have also I have killifish. I have lots of different barbs. I have probably 40 or 50 South American tetras, a bunch of African ones. a bunch of rare Danios or Devarios, those bigger things. I just bred last year Borrelios, the so-called Royal Danios,
Cool.
which came about because a colleague of mine in Sweden was showing a brief video, and they were breeding like you would expect from salmonids in the sand. And everybody that has bred any sort of Danio type fish, you can just breed them over a screen. And obviously with those guys, it never worked because the problem is you need a substrate. They lay the eggs into the sand. So you need sand or fine gravel. And so I was like, oh, I tried that. And a week later, I had fry swimming. So sometimes it's just seeing the right idea from somebody. And of course, having the fish and having the fish properly conditioned is rule number one. I'm always, when people ask me, how do you breed fish? And I said, buy the best parents you can possibly buy. Start with that, because everything else may or may not work.
Yeah. Do you think working in the publishing side of the hobby or the industry has opened more doors to kind of inside information on breeding? Has it helped? Or
to a certain degree. Now, a caveat is from I think 94 to 2006. I was the editor for the German Catfish, Loach, Barb, and Tetra Association. So I had, even before I came to the US, I had lots of contacts, mostly in Germany, but all across Europe, which is helping us now because those personal relationships. I mean, people like Ingo Seidel or Hans Georg Evers in Germany, those are very close friends of mine for over 30 years. And so we can call each other at pretty much any time of the day. And having those connections is essential to publish a magazine, because obviously you can't write everything on your own. And everybody has knowledge that you don't. I mean, I learn pretty much every day something new, which is what always has pushed me into science. But then also, fish keeping is, there's, I don't know, somewhere between 30 and 50,000 species of fish, depending what you include and what you call a species or not. And so you're never going to run out of something you have not tried. And I mean, that's what's so fantastic. And I've actually always admired the hobby in Australia, considering that your limitations are probably the most severe of any country. Or in New Zealand, I don't know how New Zealand is, but I know Australia is
we're pretty tight.
Right. Yeah. So far we were able to avoid that. I mean, I'm very often in contact with people here in the trade, trying to negotiate with policymakers for a better policy, because the issue is if you, for example, come with roundabout rules like, oh, no wild fish or some other crazy idea, it has lots of consequences that are not intended. And very often, even lawmakers don't know. Most of them actually have good intentions. They don't want invasive species, which we all know is a fundamental problem. But that is usually not solved. I mean, people get run over by cars. The solution is not that we forbid cars.
Correct. Yeah.
And with fish keeping, I compare it's the same sort of thing. You need rules, but you also need a responsible trade, meaning the people who are in the trade need to, what I should call that, wipe out the black sheep among themselves. So if you have somebody in the trade that does not follow the rules, I always say that harms everybody.
I totally agree. Yeah. Yeah, the rules are there for a reason, rightly or wrongly, and adapting them for your own personal reasons is not the way around getting what you want done.
I mean, it just harms
Mm.
us because that is what then ends up in the newspapers or the evening news as, oh, we found another snakehead or pacu or some other. And I'm always like, these are fringe fishes, call them. I mean, they're in terms of market value, they have absolute zero commercial value. I mean, it's it's minuscule. And yet you have people who think this is something we should keep. And I'm like, you can make regulations or exemptions for people like that, special permits, all that kind of stuff. But the average fish keeper that has a community tank, what does he want to do with a foot-long snakehead?
Correct.
I mean, it
doesn't want
everything.
But the problem lies, those little snakeheads, or those footlongs, they start off that size, and they can be in an aquarium shop, and somebody comes in and they see that and they think, I want that, and somebody in the shop, uneducated or looking for short-term gains, is happy to pass that on without caring about the repercussions, and then that's when the problems arise.
I mean, that's the problem that, say, here in the US, common example are pangasius or iridescent sharks. It's a terrible aquarium fish. It grows a bit too big. I mean, the size of a foot and a half is not the problem, but the fish is enormously skittish. The first thing he does, he runs his head into the glass pretty much every time you step towards the aquarium. So it's actually an animal welfare question, even in this particular case. But the problem is when they're like 2 inches long, they're super pretty. You know, they have that iridescent bluish, blackish appearance, and sold by big box stores here. And obviously, half the time the employees don't even know what that is. And it just gets sold. And I'm like, pull that out of the offerings. There are other fish, say little mistos species out of Southeast Asia or Pimelodus types that have a similar appearance, but they top out at 3 to 4 inches. And you can keep them in a 40-gallon tanks all their life. It's not a problem. They're not going to kill themselves. And they don't end up somewhere in a pond, which is always when I call it the shit hits the fan, because the fish then end up in the news or somebody released something, and it's not good for the fish to begin with. It's not good for the hobbyist who has a problem he can't solve. He may even give up, which is then bad for the dealer who sold it in the first place. And politically speaking, it's a shot in the foot. So all things considered, it just has losers, these sorts of sales.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We don't have iridescent sharks, pacus, snakeheads, anything like that, and I'm pretty happy about that. But we definitely do have some larger fish that, in my mind, shouldn't be in the trade. And any time that they pop up available on wholesale lists, I don't purchase them to resell them for that reason. I feel like I'm doing my part and not causing the issue by not carrying the issue, if that kind of makes sense. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, there are people who have the tanks and also the knowledge to keep fish like that. And I'm always say certain states here in the US have different rules, and for certain species you actually need special permits in certain states. And I'm all for that. If you want something special, you as long as you can prove essentially that you have the means to keep it, and then why not? But it should not be sold to the average aquarist who does not have the knowledge. And obviously, that's the bigger problem we're facing these days is the hobby is a bit limited. It's not really growing that much. And part of it has potentially to do with there's ever fewer literature around because everybody switches to online media. The big problem is if you are a beginner, if you come out, say, you are a father, you have a child, 10, 12-year-old, and you want to give them an aquarium, where do you even start today? I mean, hopefully you have a good pet shop nearby that can help you get started. But if that's not the case, with longer distances, say in Australia or in New Zealand or here in the US, it might not be so easy to find a reasonable pet shop nearby. And then weeding through the jungle of the internet is a separate problem in terms of where to find reasonable information.
Yeah, totally agree. Helen brought up a really good point here. She said it before, just because a tiny handful of people can keep a species ethically doesn't mean that species should be freely available to every idiot who wants one, which is quite a fair comment and a fair call.
Right. Yeah, the interesting thing is that when we're talking monster fish, which is usually sort of used as a catch-all term for these, it's sort of a short-term thing too. It's a very typical, how should I say, clientele that keeps them. It tends to be males, somewhere between 15 and 25 for the most part. And once they grow up, they develop more interest then, or maybe a more differentiated interest. Maybe they realize now that's actually not that much fun. A lot of these fish aren't exactly that interesting in the long run. And they turn around. But the problem then comes, what do you do with something that potentially lives somewhere between 20 and 50 years, depending what it is? And I can tell you, I know a lot of zookeepers who do not need more big fish because they have plenty, and lots of pet stores don't want to take them back. And my answer there is, don't sell them to begin with. Then you don't have to take them back.
Correct.
The problem with monster fish, is that something that you try and tackle using your publications? Do you run campaigns or anything like that, or?
Yes, when we talk about a certain species, very often put, even if the author not necessarily puts it in the main article, we often put little boxes in. I mean, snakeheads are in general forbidden in the United States. Yet we publish articles about it because, first of all, we have a worldwide audience, especially in Asia. And so putting, essentially censoring it isn't really helpful. I'm more for, let's put the information out there, and also then say put a little box in. Same sort of thing. Say we're writing about the zebra pleco, and my good friend Leandro Sousa in Altamira, who is heavily involved with lawmaking in Brazil. The second, for example, the new Brazilian lists came up, we always publish something on the Amazonas website and then in the magazine about what the rules mean. So take essentially the legal text and boil it down to what does this mean for the average keeper. Now, something that has changed, and that was kind of a fight at the last COPPA meeting. There was a push to put the zebra pleco, Hypancistris zebra, onto Appendix 1, which makes trade extremely difficult. Now, the idea was you wanted to prevent it from being collected in Brazil, but the problem with CITES rules is that it affects the global trade, meaning the breeders in Indonesia or in Germany or even here in the US then all have to obey by the same rules. Luckily, thanks through work on the political side, they became only Appendix 2, which means you can, with the proper permit, you can import and export animals that have been tank raised, which is actually what you really want. I mean, I know a lot of people, especially in the frog trade, they want essentially to combat illegal collecting by making tank raised or captive raised animals readily available. I mean, once again,
that's a logical way of doing that. Make them so easily available that the idea of taking them out illegally becomes just financially not worthwhile.
Right. There's a little problem with that for certain species where it then kind of muddies the water for law enforcement, because sometimes you can't judge if something is farm raised or captive raised or comes from a breeder. And so the wild caught animals can be whitewashed in that. But as we see, especially with the dart frogs, they're so easy to breed in most cases that the second the form has entered the trade, there's so many people breeding them that in short terms, there's plenty of babies available that you don't need wild collected ones. But there's a little bit of an almost religious fight going on, especially when stuff comes out of Brazil. In general, frogs out of Brazil are illegal, period. There's no if and else. Wow. But whenever they describe a new morph, it takes about 2 months and they pop up somewhere in the trade.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the established people immediately say, well, this is an illegal animal. So, but the problem is then what happens when they get caught at the border, even if in one particular case, one morph popped up, was then bred in large quantities in Europe and was intercepted by US Fish and Wildlife entering the country. But the problem is they don't even know what to do with it. And so they often end up either in holding areas or in some cases they kill the animals, which is not exactly useful either.
No, not at all.
Animals. But I've always said a good collaboration between the commercial trade, established breeders, but also hobby organizations like aquarium clubs or national organizations like Cichlid or Froggers or anybody coming together and talking to each other. Because then I have a good relationship with US Fish and Wildlife, and in the past, occasionally, one or the other inspector called me up and say, I have this. Do you know what this is? And send me a picture. And that helps them. And at the end of the day, we just want to keep animals in proper ways, if possible, propagate them and share the knowledge of what the biology of these animals is. And I think 90% of people who keep fish, they don't really want to breed. They just want to have a nice tank. But they also want to be sure that the animals they buy are, reasonably either collected or bred or in other way transported, because none of them wants to harm nature.
No. Okay. Well, you obviously you run the company SwissTropicals. Can you explain to people that maybe don't know what that is and how you approach this issue of the illegal fish trade as a company that deals in fish?
You mean the what SwissTropical does for the most part?
Oh yeah, I mean obviously you run the company SwissTropicals.
Yep.
What measures as a company do you have in place to make sure you don't get caught up in anything
illegal? You mean?
Yeah, I'm not saying that. What I mean is obviously you'll have things in place to prevent or to highlight when the nature of the game you're going to come across these issues. It's just interesting from an industry's point of view what you do to try and prevent that.
Right. Well, when it comes to say anything, say dry goods or so, that of course simply gets imported legally with paperwork, etc. Now, when it comes to animals, it has all to do with having the right connections. I mean, in the past, when I was still at Ohio State, I used to have a U.S. Fish and Wildlife import license. So very often when I went to Europe and visited friends, when I brought fish back, I legally declared them. And that's also how I got to know U.S. Fish and Wildlife officers over time. So making yourself smart is the first thing.
Okay.
And it's the excuse I didn't know just doesn't count. No, you will lose in front of court. You will lose in front of the inspector. I mean, it's just I didn't know is not a good excuse. So make yourself smart about what the rules are. Sometimes it's a little more difficult than in other cases. Depends on the country. Depends on what you're dealing with. But ever since I'm up here in near Minneapolis, Minneapolis is not what is called a port of entry unless you have an exemption permit. So it becomes a little more difficult. But I have so many people in the wholesale trade that I know as friends. I mean, I would say whatever is normally commercially available is pretty much a 5-minute email or phone call away in terms of getting it organized if I would need something. And then because some of the wholesalers advertise with us, both in Coral and Amazonas, I very often get the newest list every week sent straight to my inbox, so I see what's out there. And so I very often have a heads up before stuff even shows up, because sometimes friends of mine email me, hey, I got this. I know you like this type of fish. Are you interested? Before they even sell it to other stores or the wider public. So it's a little bit insider trading. But very often in the hobby is not necessarily what you know, it's who you know, as a friend of mine said.
Is there, over there, I'm assuming there's a significant amount of wholesalers. There's probably a significant amount of wholesalers per kind of region. Is there wholesalers that would be considered kind of a little bit dodgy or sketchy, or as in openly knowledge, or does it just kind of happen? Because obviously the ones that you use are very trusted and you consider friends and that sort of stuff. But the other ones peppered around the place that are just a little bit dodgy.
Well, the problem here in the US is you do not need any sort of knowledge in order to get efficient. I mean, if you can spell your name and know your birthday and have a phone number and a US address, it costs you $100 to get an import license per year. It's dirt cheap. You do not have to prove that you have a facility or any,
It costs me 3 times that to get a pet shop license here in the UK.
Right. Well, the same problem in Europe. If you want to open a pet shop or you want to import animals, you need to have what they call the Sachkundenachweis, which means essentially as a subject matter license. So you need to pass a test, and that's not necessary. So you can have, I mean, that's essentially how I got my license in the past. But as I said, it's not necessary to actually know something or that you have a facility that could properly house the animals. Now, in some states, say Florida, you might have to, with the local authorities, the state authorities, you might have to have a special permit, because when you house the animals, then you need to make sure they don't get out. And so they might come and check that they can't get loose. So that if you have a fish farm, that your farm has certain measures in place that they can't enter the waterways from there. But yeah, other than that, you have a bunch of basement dealers here, and I have seen it multiple times at fish conventions that this fish box literally came the day before straight out of Brazil or Colombia or Peru, and then in a hotel room, and people sell out of kiddie pools and other things. Yes, the fish are dirt cheap compared to what you would have to pay if it goes through proper import, but the survival rate also goes way down, because if a fish has been transported for 24 to 48 hours coming out of country of origin, if you don't know what you're doing, the likelihood of actually quarantining that fish successfully, bringing it to eat and adapting it to conditions is slim. And if you keep it in a hotel room for the first 3 days over the weekend, your rate of success goes way down. Unfortunately, a lot of people they look just at I don't know how many times I've seen gold nugget plecos for $15 in a hotel room.
Wow.
And I can usually just tell, because what they do is they flare their fins like crazy because they're cold, number one, and number two is they usually have ectoparasite. And those fish, if they are under these conditions for the next 2 or 3 days before they get taken home, their survival chance is pretty much zero.
Sounds like it's like illegal black market.
It's well, I wouldn't call it black because it's legally speaking.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like it's legal, but
right. So I call this a gray market.
Yeah.
But I've always sort of, it's often so, even in auctions here, that you find wild caught fish.
Mm-hmm.
To me, growing up in Switzerland, an auction was actually with tank raised fish. That was my understanding. You bring your own. And I had a good friend, an elder gentleman at that time. We kept the fish room together for a while, and then after we bred a bunch of fish, he started to try to figure out, how can I widen my availability? So he started to buy fish, either transshipped or from wholesalers. And I was like, I thought our plan was to actually breed fish and sell them. And so we kind of fell out over that, because to me, that was not really the way I was thinking about it. I sell fish too, but these are my own tank raised fish. I'm not buying fish from a wholesaler and then flip them and sell them on. When I get fish from my friends at the wholesale places, they're strictly for my own, and I pay more than the wholesale prices too, for the simple reason at that point I'm a consumer, end user, so, and not really a wholesale customer. And
do you cover this sort of topic in the magazines, as in like semi-legal, legal imports, and backyard breeding and convention trade and that kind of stuff? Are these topics that are discussed in any of your magazines?
We occasionally touch on the legal status of given species, or like 2 years ago when there was a big threat here where it actually went all the way through the house here, the parliament, and then was luckily in the reconciliation, it was killed off. It would have pretty much limited the availability of species to about 200 species, much worse than Australia's list. Luckily, it died in Congress, but we were very active. We sent newsletters to our readers and said, talk to your representative. This would have been kneecapping the fish trade in the US completely. I mean,
Yeah,
this.
we had something similar here in the UK. The campaign was called Hands Off Our Hobby. And the UK magazine PFK, they kind of got behind that. And I think that did make a difference because we've still got more or less the same amount of fish on our lists than ever before. So, I think when it comes to issues like that, magazines like yourselves have a massive voice and a capacity to really, really kind of make a difference. So it's good that it's hobbyists like yourself that are running the magazine and not just some corporate person that doesn't have a clue. I mean, what was the reason? If we can just talk a bit more about the magazines itself, what drove you to join Amazonas?
Well, it was actually Amazonas was originally founded by my friend Hans Evers,
Mm-hmm.
Germany, the German edition, and then in what was that, 2012, 2011, something like that, Reef to Rainforest, the previous publisher, brought out an English version, an English license copy. And then in 2012, Hans hooked me up with the publisher there and said, they need a translator that actually knows the topic. I mean, translating language is fairly straightforward, but actually making sure that the sentences make sense in terms of content, that's a slightly different topic. And so I started to translate both for coral and Amazonas, working closely with the owner, James Lawrence, and his partner, Judy Billard, for many years, for 6 or 7 years. And then at one point, his health wasn't that great. And so he asked if I wanted to take over Amazonas, and eventually we got an agreement to lessen his load. And then Aquatic Media Press was founded. And together with my colleague, Matt Peterson, who lives 3 hours north of here in Duluth, Minnesota, we continued the production. We used pretty much the same design team that still works for us now. And so it went from there. And then last spring, April, James died. And Judy was, we helped keeping it going, coral, for a while. And then she came to me a couple of months later and said, how about you take over coral too? And we got to an agreement. And so we have it now integrated pretty much fully into Aquatic Media Press. We're still, there's still lots of loose ends that Matt and I have to tie up. But unfortunately, the loose ends are always at the very end of the day type things. But we have both magazines are running pretty smooth. We have a new editor for coral, and he's very, very dedicated in making it the best marine magazine there is. And obviously, Amazonas has been the lead freshwater magazine now for many, many years. I mean, TFH is still around, but it's published by a company that distributes aquarium products. So it has a little bit of it's not an independent publication. I mean, I know pretty much every bigger company in the US. I know the owners or the people that stand behind it, but we're still independent. I mean, they have no influence. Even if they advertise with us, they have no influence over the content.
That's good.
I mean, I always tell people, I have nothing against ideas, but we're not going to push something or not push something else just because it doesn't fit your, commercial interests or so. the end of the day, we want people to be successful in fish keeping. This is my single biggest goal, is that if somebody starts with a fish tank, that they're successful, that the fish stay alive, because first of all, that's very good for the fish.
Yep.
But it's also important. I think I see too many people getting into the hobby, and then within a year or so, they're out of the hobby because something went wrong. They couldn't get the help they needed to fix the problem. And that's actually something Amazonas and Coral are both what I would call more advanced publications. And so it was a couple of years ago, a new subscriber for Amazonas asked me, do you have an index of beginner articles among the archive that I could look up to learn more? And I was like, oh, that's a good question. The answer is really, we don't. I mean, yes, we have index, but it's not, sometimes it's a paragraph here or article there that is useful for a beginner, but not really a compendium. So this is actually something we're currently working on. I don't know if people can see this. Let's see, the other way around. So we're working on a special edition.
Okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
I was watching a stream last night from another dude that does fish stuff, and he was interviewing Dr. Basslier, and when Dr. Basslier wanted to show some stuff, he dropped himself off the screen, so it went full screen to what he was showing. I was like, oh, I'm going to try that right now, but I totally made a mistake and just dropped everybody off but me. So I tried, but I got it wrong.
That's all right. No worries. But it's the idea came essentially, we need a beginner magazine that essentially is just a single issue. It should be valid today as well as in 5 years from now. Doing just the basics: a tank, some substrate, a light, a filter, a heater. That's it. No big discussion about nitrogen cycle or 17 different filter types. At the end of the day, a lot of it is personal preference. Ultimately, you just want, say, that 12-year-old person that is totally geeky into fish, that they can set up an aquarium following essentially basic instructions and end up with a tank that works. The fish are happy, the plants are growing, and their interest is kept. And we pitched that idea to a lot of our advertisers, and I mean, the response of every single one was like, this is exactly what we need. This, because they all, especially those that have been in the trade for a long time and are fish people or animal people as well, which the vast majority actually are. There's a few where the corporate interests are different in the background, but the people on the ground of many of those companies are animal keepers and very friendly folks for the most part. There's a few exceptions, but
so with the majority of people being animal orientated, how does that affect the decision of what features go into each each edition of the magazine? Is there an element of a process that's in place for that, or do you just kind of read what's going on in the world at that time and lean towards trends? How does that work?
It depends a lot. I mean, obviously we have little columns where we do little fish portraits, or Coral, for example, has a Coral Visions, which is a column that talks about, say, new coral variants or specific types that are raised by some of our reef community breeders, or coral farms, I should say. And so that up-to-date stuff is certainly something we focus on. I mean, just a few days ago, the revision of Corridoras was published.
Yeah.
And so it's gonna, I mean, I've known about it because I know Louis Tenkat and Hans Evers and Ian Fuller in the UK are good friends of mine. And so we have been knowing this for a while, that this is coming. We even knew which genera will be resurrected, all that kind of stuff. But now it's official. Now we can actually talk about it. And we're already working in the background on covering this, so that the timely stuff is certainly there. But then the other thing is we always have cover topics on a given issue where we say, okay, we're going to focus on this group a bit. Well, we try to mix it up so that, say, somebody is more interested in cichlids, they don't end up with 5 magazines in a row where there's no cichlids, because that would not be good. We also don't want, 3 issues that just go into tetras. So we try to split that up a little. I mean, one of the most recent ideas that went through my mind was, how about hatchet fish? Now you run immediately into one problem. There's only 9 currently described hatchet fish species. So it's very limited, and other than having different names and different shapes, they're pretty much all the same to keep. So there's only limited ways of covering that. But we were then thinking maybe we make an issue about surface insectivores. I mean, that's not the title, because we don't want fancy titles like that. We want something more where people can immediately know what we're talking about. But one of the things, of course, that was immediately mentioned in that regard was archerfish. Because there are surface hunters, they go after insects. But then you also have the Asian hatchet fish, where there are several. And then, of course, the butterfly fish out of Africa was mentioned too. But in the term of the archer, immediately, oh, that's also a brackish water fish. And we have never done a brackish water issue. So that sort of was spawned as a side thing in a discussion with one of the editorial members. And so in no time, we had like 3 or 4 different cover topics that came out of a single idea initially. And the team is great in that regard, that if somebody has some brain fart, they usually immediately send a note to at least one or the other person, and then it usually kind of spreads. And that's how we create content. And then we go out and ask. We have authors all over the world where we know have knowledge about something, and if I know somebody specifically that has an interest in a given fish group, a good example is we were talking about the river loaches, the Nemachelos and Chistura types out of Asia, where there's literally hundreds of species. And a German colleague, Jens Kühne, who lives in Thailand, is probably one of the most knowledgeable people about the habitats, because he goes collecting all the time. And so I contacted him and asked him if he would be interested to contribute, and immediately said yes. So this is how we go about creating content. We come up with an idea, then we think about what are the best people that have the most knowledge about, try to pull them in to write for us. The only problem I have as a publisher is always, this is, as my wife will call it, the most expensive hobby I have. Because print publishing isn't exactly something that makes you rich, I can guarantee you that. And I can also tell you that anybody who writes for us is not getting rich doing that. But the amazing thing is we have a bunch of ichthyologists and, of course, tons of hobbyists that are willing to write for a really modest amount of money when you consider how much time it sometimes takes to put something together. I'm really, really happy to have so many good friends and colleagues who are actually, for the sake of the hobby, are willing to share the knowledge they have
Yeah.
For an apple and an egg, pretty much. And
Yeah.
I would.
And it is truly the love for the hobby that drives everything forward, isn't it?
Yeah, I would just love if you know. The only thing I can say to any listener here, get a subscription, because that's how we pay our authors. That's how we pay our printers and the team who does. The thing is not a crazy sum of money. I mean, here in the US, it's $39 for 6 issues delivered to your door.
It's cheap as chips.
Yeah,
that is incredibly cheap.
And I mean, worldwide it's $69. So we have to add pretty much $6 an issue to ship it worldwide. But you could have access to the digital archive, which goes all the way back to 2014, and with both titles now.
Wow.
Where you can, and the reader, the digital edition is fantastic in terms, I mean, it's literally the exact same thing that we have in print that you can literally flip through. And
is that directly off the website? That if you want to tell people where they can find that, if people are interested?
Right, yeah. If you go either coralmagazine.com or amazonasmagazine.com, or you can go to the parent page, aquaticmediapress.com. There is links to both publications. There's a web shop. You can subscribe. There's different ways of subscribing, either through the database system, Subscription Genius, or we also have a WooCommerce site. Sometimes people have troubles with PayPal because the Subscription Genius system is connected to PayPal only. And sometimes it's finicky and forces people to create PayPal accounts, and some people don't want that. So we set up a WooCommerce, which is also actually, the credit cards are processed by PayPal, but it doesn't force people to set up a PayPal account first. So
we've had a question from one of the watchers. Have you ever had to relearn everything you thought you knew about a particular fish species due to new information coming to light?
Oh, sure. I mean, the good example are those royal danios, the beryllios. I tried to breed 3 or 4 species beforehand, and I set them up like I do danios, devarios, or lots of barbs and tetras over a screen, and yeah, they never laid eggs. They just didn't. And I could see the female is totally gravid, full of eggs. The male is chasing her in the tank before I put them in the breeding tank, and just like, okay, this doesn't work. Why not? No clue. And then I saw this brief 20-second video of a Swedish colleague who just like, oh, it looks like they're breeding or something, and they were just digging themselves into the sand, pretty much like you would see from a trout. And then immediately, a whole Christmas tree of lights went up, and I said, that's it. The biology is different. They're not egg scatterers in plants. They're actually a substrate breeder. So totally different behavior. And so immediately I was like, okay, if we want to breed these, you have to approach it from a totally different way. The biology is slightly different, despite the fact they're looking as if they occupy the same niche. And then I don't know if you know what Rayamas is. Rayamas is a genus out of Africa, which is it's also a Danionine style fish. It has huge mouth. And talking to a colleague from Michigan, and he reported the same thing, that they also breed in sand. So I have some downstairs in my fish room as well. And as soon as I see that they're big enough, they get fairly large. They get a good 6 to 8 inches. And they're those things are like an arrow. They shoot through the tank. I've not done a single water change without putting some fish back in the tank. You don't walk away when you do water changes. You lift the glass, and the first thing that happens is something comes flying towards you.
That's funny.
But yes, that's where I had to completely revamp my assumptions of how to breed them.
Cool.
And well, trying to think, maybe I come up with a more profound example in terms of oh yeah, but probably one that has more to do with filtration. You know, in the average literature, people talk about nitrate processing. So you end up with ammonia and end up with nitrate at the end, and without going into the whole chemical part because that's kind of boring. But to me, it was always an interesting thing. Why does the nitrate levels not just keep going up if you don't do water changes? And I've had tanks where sometimes I haven't done a water change in like 4 or 5 months, but I fed every day, and you would assume at that point the nitrate levels would have to be in the hundreds of milligrams per liter. But it just tops out somewhere around 50 or 60 and never goes higher. And then because I'm a molecular biologist, I was like, okay, what's the process going on? And eventually I started to read more about biofilms, and then understanding that biofilms are layers of microorganisms. And the top one, which is exposed to the water column, is oxygenated, but the lower levels are completely anaerobic, so no oxygen. And so what actually is happening is that you do have denitrification happening in the lower layers. And that's happening in foam media, in sintered glass media, anything that has a large surface. Now, the literature always says, oh, you need either deep sand beds or you need like a humongously thick substrate with anaerobic zones in order to achieve that. So soil aquariums, or the so-called Wallstedt method, is often mentioned. Now, the truth is you don't really need any of this. Your regular canister filter will be able to do this as long as it runs for a long while. It takes a long time for the biofilm to really establish itself. But then it will process nitrate and break it down into nitrogen and oxygen and release it up into the atmosphere as a gas, essentially. And so that would explain why, for example, in most of my tanks, which run with the Matten filter principle, why I can actually keep relatively large amount of fish in a given tank without having any issues, because I just have a huge filter surface.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the biggest takeaway for it is your effective filtration surface is the most critical part. It doesn't really matter what the vessel is, if it's a canister, if it's a Matten filter or a cube filter or a sponge filter or a hang-on bag. Any of those things can do it as long as the surface ratio to bioload is reasonable.
So what I've just taken from that and heard from that is that every filter has the capability of becoming an anaerobic filter system.
Yes.
Given time to do so, given enough surface area for bacteria to, in layman's term, penetrate deep enough for that process to happen. Is that correct?
Yes. So if you take, say, foam, or you can also do like lava rock, does pretty much the same thing, except it's a mess to to put in and take it out. But anything that has a large surface area will essentially be covered with that biofilm. If you go into a stream, you see the same thing. It's that slimy stuff that covers pretty much anything.
Yeah.
Every rock, every piece of wood. In the fish tank, you can even see or feel it if you go with your hand on the inside of the glass. if you don't, say, clean the sides. And I'm not talking about algae. I'm literally talking about the slightly, not necessarily slimy, but slick surface that you feel.
Yeah.
And that's the biofilm. I mean, it's microscopic. It's very thin, but it can contain several dozen, if not hundreds, of layers of various organisms, and they work sort of in concert, because one does one step, then the next does another step, and so on. It's almost like a conveyor belt or a car assembly system, where the doors go on and then the wheels go on, and this happens sort of in a similar way. It's a community, a microbial community that works together.
Is there things that you can do to encourage that to grow? I know it does grow naturally, but is there ways that you can stimulate the growth of a biofilm for particular fish species that thrive on that?
What I always do when I set up a new tank, or even if I help somebody set up a new tank, is I either dump a used filter into the new tank to essentially inoculate it, or a simple thing is you just squeeze out the sponge filter into a bucket and you dump that into the tank. It looks horrible in a brand new tank for the first couple of days, but it's the best jump start, because first of all, it's free.
Yeah,
nothing beats free. But it's actually it's an already established community. It has pretty much all the various players there. And if you squeeze out a foam filter, you get pretty much everything coming. I mean, there's still a lot stuck to the filter that doesn't come off, but it allows you to inoculate, so jump starting it. And then the next thing is let your filters run as long as possible. The problem sometimes, a lot of filter types are built based on horsepower, gallon per hours or liters per hours, and companies sometimes advertise, oh, this runs 5,000 gallons an hour. And I'm like, other than making the electrical company happy that bills you for the electricity you use, it doesn't necessarily do that much. The trick is that you want the filter to run as long as possible undisturbed, so that biofilm can grow and then be established. So if you clean your filter every week, and I see that a lot with as one of the beginner mistakes, and Cam probably knows that from his store too, people try to be too clean. And so they go in every week, take the filter apart, no matter what model, and clean it out until it's literally completely clean. But that's actually counterproductive. That mud and that biofilm that develops, or the brown sludge that you have in a canister filter, for example, that's like liquid gold, if you want to say so, because it contains all the microorganisms that are needed to break down the waste products from your tank. And so leaving that undisturbed is important. Another big thing is the substrate. People go like every week when they do a water change, vacuum the tank. And I would say, just take the hose and maybe pick up the loose stuff on the surface, but don't necessarily go into it, because your substrate is another huge filter that helps stabilize the aquarium. And we see that in nature, the river banks and the bottom of creeks and lakes. I mean, that stuff is just full of life and helps maintain the water quality that you need in order to keep the animals alive and keep the water clear.
I'm just sitting on a couple of things that you've mentioned a few minutes ago. You basically said that any filter can become an anaerobic filter, regardless of the style, as long as the surface ratio is able to do that. Do you know what that ratio is, or is there some particular?
There is from aquaculture, the sort of standard rule for warm water cultivation, say tilapia is an example. Barramundi will probably go into the same thing. They say for a pound of fish, you need 3 square feet. Now, nobody, or you shouldn't, feed your tropical aquarium fish the same way you feed aquaculture fish, like 5 to 10 times a day. You're not trying to grow protein. What you want to keep is your fish alive. So I would, and I don't know for sure if there is a really good, say, minimum thing, but I would presume you could go with a third of that easily. So a square foot per pound of fish. Now, I don't know, obviously we have some crazy fish keeper, me included, that have lots of fish, but the average fish tank probably only contains maybe 1/10 of a pound of fish if you look at the actual body weight. And so, that gives you, if you say 1 pound requires 1 square foot of filter surface, then you say 1/10 of that will be 1/10 of, so 144, that would be, say, 15 square inches of surface. And that's tiny. I mean, a relatively small sponge filter will have that surface area. The question is then the flow rate. And that's what I mentioned before with the, sometimes the flow rate is too big. So the filter volume compared to the flow rate is not reasonable, because if it flows through too fast, then the processing is not optimal. Now, you can argue it doesn't really matter because it then flows through it again. So even if you only process 10% of the waste in each flow or time period, if you run it through 10 times, you get to the same end result. But as I said, it doesn't make any sense because you either use more air or more electricity to drive your pump. But the issue is always look at what you're doing in terms of what's your bioload. I mean, a crazy thing is I have a whole bunch of barb babies downstairs, and there's probably in an average 10 gallon, there's probably 200, 250 babies. They're just about an inch long, and they get fed 2 or 3 times a day. And there's a 4-inch cube filter in those tanks, and I do water change like once a week, about a third. And they grow nicely. And you would think that many fish in that little amount, I mean, that's 40, or net is probably closer to 35 liters only of water. That's crazy, but as long as you feed high quality feed that has a good digestibility, that's the other part of the equation. If you feed crap, well, crap goes in, crap comes out. The fish can't digest the food, it's gonna feed your filter or your algae or have other consequences you don't want. So I always said, if your best friend for your aquarium is a decent filter and a good quality feed, that is by far the biggest pieces of things you need to have.
This is it's probably the second time that we've had a guest on, and they've discussed a very similar thing regarding filtration, quantity and quality to properly establish longevity and health of fish. And I think everybody as a hobbyist knows that we need a filter, but it's almost a totally, I don't want to say it's an unknown black art, but it is something that's not really discussed. But the marketing side of it wins out the actual knowledge side of how the filtration units are meant to work for the health of fish. So having this sort of conversation is quite, I mean, for me, and I'm sure it's been quite open for people that are in the chat as well, and anyone that's going to watch afterwards, how that kind of works and the elements of keeping fish healthy and getting to anaerobic states and that kind of stuff. So thank you for that. I think that's quite an eye-opening little 10 minutes or so we've just had then.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I mean, as I said, the goal of the whole thing is to make it work. And the reason why SwissTropicals exists is because I built my own fish tanks and my filtration units when I built the first fish room here, and then people saw what is known worldwide as Hamburg Matten Filter. And then they asked me, where can I get that? And I'm like, well, I'm bringing it over from Europe for my fish room. And I was like, well, can you share some? And I was like, well, dragging it piece by piece over in the luggage isn't the most effective way. And then a fellow discus dealer here in the US who brought in German discus asked me if he could chime in, and eventually we imported the first few pallets together. And then he concentrated on his discus, and eventually I became the distributor for that German company here in the US, which is, I think in New Zealand you have somebody else, purely Poret or so. Some folks there who set it up a few years later for New Zealand, and I guess they're still around as far as I know. I mean, we probably emailed a few times. I don't know if they're still.
I think they might have closed down last year. I might be talking out of tune here, but I think they closed down last year. I might be wrong, but or maybe they closed down their hatchery. I'm not entirely sure, but it is definitely available here in New Zealand via them. Or at least it was, so I've got sheets of it out the back in some of my filters.
Right. No, and then it became ever bigger, and then it was actually at one of the catfish meeting, the so-called L number days meetings in Germany. I run into two fellow fish keepers from Bavaria that make those jet lifter tubes, and I've always made my own out of PVC, but it's kind of tedious to do it. So, and their system is based on the so-called Czech airlifters, which push the air in at the bottom through small holes and super efficient. And out of that initial thing, it developed into a bigger collaboration, and now I'm bringing in 40-foot shipping containers of foam to the US, and big boxes of lifters and a bunch of other things over the years. I've always looked for niches. I'm not somebody who just like, okay, somebody is selling something and makes money, I'm gonna try to jump on the same bandwagon. I've always looked for stuff that is not out there, and I like stuff that works. The fewer parts, the better. And price is for me secondary, because if it works, if it does what it's supposed to do, then the money you spend initially for it is actually secondary. Because I have Matten filters that are over 10 years old. Obviously, unless you give the lift tube to your dog to chew on, or you step on it, so they essentially live forever. It's PVC. They're not going anywhere. So the investment is maybe a bit steep at the beginning, but in the long run, it's the most cost-effective filter system that you could come up with.
We've got a question from Mike regarding the magazine, but I just want to touch on, just while we're talking about filtration, the Hamburg filtration setup. Can you please explain that in a bit of detail to people? What it is, how it works, and what actually makes it so incredibly good?
You mean the process of how we publish?
We've got a question from one of the viewers, but before we dive into that question, what Cam was asking you to do was just kind of describe the filters that we've just been talking about and how they work for anybody that doesn't know about them?
So the system goes back, I don't know, 60s, 70s, somewhere in Germany. That's why the term Hamburg for the city of Hamburg came up. I'm not 100% sure it was really developed there. Nobody seems to know for sure, and everybody has an opinion. But the idea was simply you take a piece of foam and you put it on one end of the tank and you pump the water from the small side into the tank, and then it passively flows through the foam to fill up the void that you just created by pumping it from one side to the other.
Okay.
And so there's tons. If you go on the website, there's some basic instructions or diagrams how they look. The thing is, the surface is essentially determined by two things. One is the dimension of the tank, because say 20 by 20 centimeter tank, you need obviously a sheet that is 20 by 20 centimeters to essentially fill the end. And then depending on the width and height of the tank, you might have to go thicker or thinner in order for it to be stable. The idea is that you pretty much have no modification to the tank. You just essentially squeeze it in. It's held by friction fit, so it's a bit wider than the tank is wide on the inside. And it just sits there, and then you cut a groove or so for the lift tube to pump it over. And you can also use a pump if you want. That's up to you. I prefer air because air is more economical. It also has the big benefit if, say, for whatever reason, the sheet actually really clogs to the point there's nothing going through, or very little going through. Not enough to fill what the pump can pump over. With a lift tube, nothing happens. Essentially, the water level drops behind to the point where it can't be lifted up anymore. So you will see that it just spatters in the front. It doesn't really run anymore, but it doesn't do anything. If you use a pump, you could potentially empty the chamber behind, and it could kill your pump, because if it runs dry, that most water pumps don't like to run without sitting in the water for very long. And in my case, I have the heater back there. So unless your heater has a emergency shut off, you run the risk that the heater explodes too. But that's why air is better. It will never empty it. I mean, it cannot lift more. As soon as it's like 1/3 or half down, it simply won't move any water anymore. So the heater will still sit in the water, and it's perfectly safe. It also has the big benefit if the water, if the electricity falls off. If a canister filter stops, and it stops for 48 hours or so, it will turn into a nasty, stinky thing. And if the power comes back on, it doesn't always do it, but it might push enough toxic stuff out that it might kill your fish. That just cannot happen with the Matten filter. And I know I did the hard test several times with power outages between 5 and 7 days in Ohio during summer storms, and in one case an ice storm in the winter, where the fish room had no power for like 5 days. And I didn't lose more than a couple of fish, simply because if the sheet just sits there, on both sides is water, it won't dry out. It also won't go anaerobic and start to go, start to decay and then cause a problem when the power comes back on. So I just stopped feeding, because fish can live for a very long time without food, and just dealt with those that have like fry, where you need to take extra precaution. But yeah, it's a very easy system, and ultimately that's any filter. It's just you have some sort of substrate and you run water through, and the better suited the substrate is, the better it will filter. There's actually some scientific papers who compared, I think they compared sintered glass, ceramic, and foam against each other. And despite the fact that sintered glass has a much bigger surface per volume, the highest amount of microorganism measured was on the foam.
Oh, wow.
And it was kind of interesting because they used two pore sizes. And based on their description, I figured out there's a 20 pores per inch and a 30 pores per inch foam. And then the ratio of how many microorganisms per volume was exactly the difference between the surface area between those two porosities. That the factor was down to the third digit exactly, which shows that what they actually measured was true, because they literally said, okay, we have 30% more surface, we have 30% more microorganisms. So I have the paper on in my thing. If anybody's interested, they can email me, I can send it to them. It's kind of cool. And it was surprising to me because a lot of people favor, say, ceramics. There's lots of different products out there, and I'm not trying to hit on anybody who makes any of those products. But it was interesting to see that it doesn't seem to foster the growth of microorganisms as much. So the only explanation I have is that the polyurethane polyether surface seems to be easier to colonize for those biofilms than a silicium oxide based thing, because ceramic and glass is pretty much the same thing, chemically speaking. It's silicium or silicon oxide. And so in principle, sand, if you want to think so, sand. And I mean, we know, for example, like the pool industry sells those sand filters, and there's a whole bunch of sand filters are used for the aquarium or the pond industry as well. So-called fluidized sand beds, so they blow the water in from the bottom. And they're very, very effective. I mean, they have a huge surface, and they have the benefit, essentially a lot of fluidized bed filters. The particles bounce into each other. And when they do, it sort of shaves off a bit of that biofilm, and then it regrows. So you keep the growth of those microorganisms in what is called a logarithmic phase all the time. So they keep growing, and because they grow so, that keeps essentially the processing up. And that's exactly what the aquaculture industries does with fluidized bed filters. So they can keep huge amounts of
So that'd be how, like, there's this moving media filter, the same principle, but on a way smaller scale.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's tons of YouTube videos about people using PET bottles and put in fluidized media and then blow the water in from the bottom and let it overflow. They actually work great. And I'm always intrigued when how much effort people put into little gadgets on their own. But that's the cool part of the hobby too. I mean, I love when people try new things, even if it's just new for them, and then it exists out there in the bigger world already. But
so we've had a question from Renee regarding your filter systems. Dr. Tanner, how do you make such perfect holes to insert the jet lifters for the cube filter or the tower filter?
Oh, it's called a big. Hi, Renee. He's a long-term customer of mine. So it's quite easy. It's a stainless steel drill. They're about 60 inches tall. They're made from seamless stainless steel pipe, and the same folks that make my lifters, actually, they're both tool makers, and so they made those for me, and so I drill them by hand essentially. Now the big cartridges that are on the website, those are made by the manufacturer. Because I need hundreds of those, it would become a fairly big amount of problems. But an easy trick that pretty much anybody can do is you take a PVC pipe and then you cut off 3 or 4 angles at the top, so you make it a bit sharp. And if you have a sharpening thing, you can even sharpen. You can do the same thing with a copper pipe, but if you do a copper pipe, just make sure that you rinse it carefully, and the first time you put it in your fish tank, use any sort of aqua-safe type thing, because if there's leftover copper in it, you want to make sure that that copper is taken care of. It doesn't end up free in the water column. Too much copper is usually not a good thing. You might kill some ick with it as a side effect, but yeah, you don't want to add heavy metals to your tank if you can avoid it. But same thing, you sharpen the front end and then you just drill into the foam block by hand. It's a little tedious. I mean, I couldn't do that for my operation here. It would take too long. But yeah, big drill press, big long filter, or a big long drill bit, and you can do it.
Cool. We'll go back to our question that Mike had regarding the magazine. Are any of the pictures in Amazonas magazine ever touched up or photoshopped? He said, I'm thinking of a July-August 2019 issue with pictures of stone rollers that look too good to be true.
That depends a little bit. It depends on the source of the image. We prefer to get the raw images so that our editorial or design staff can work on it to make sure that the resolution is right, that the format is right, because they get converted to CMYK for printing purposes. I mean, red, green, blue is what you see on the screen. CMYK is the language printing presses use to print. So we try not to do that, but occasionally we get images from the German side or even from direct where somebody has already fiddled with the image.
Right.
And we try to avoid that because we don't really want it to look crazy. Now the 2019, that might be the native fishes issue. And they might be from, what's his name? Will come to me. He's actually an extremely good underwater photographer here in the US, and his images are top notch. So if it's Sabo is his last name. If it's his image, then no, it hasn't been photoshopped, because he does a great job creating images, and he takes very good care of not fiddling with it. He's a long-term member of the North American Native Fish Association, and probably the most prolific but also most successful underwater photographer in his field, no doubt.
How do you go about getting your images? Like, you discussed how the sort of topics come around, and you've got a topic. Do you then shoulder tap some people? Do you have appropriate images for this topic? Is that how that sort of works for the magazine?
Well, we're lucky that a lot of my friends have humongous, I don't know how many tens of thousands of images. Ingo Seidel, Hans Evers, and other friends have. Sabo certainly has an almost bottomless reservoir of images. So that's our first thing. I mean, ideally we get images from the authors, because we know this is actually the right fish that is talked about. Because believe it or not, I've seen people breed fish for 5 years, and what they thought the fish is, it's not not the correct ID. And it's not necessarily that they are ignorant. It's sometimes simply because some fish might be so close that if somebody who's not really deep into the whole taxonomy and nomenclature may actually mistake them for something else. And so that's certainly the author is our primary source. We always say, if you write something, good pictures is pretty much the door into publishing with Amazonas or Coral. Now, if it's something like really good in terms of content, but the person just doesn't have pictures, doesn't have the means to take good pictures or so, then we look with our collaborators and ask around, do you have something? Occasionally we use Shutterstock. That's sort of the last resort. These are images we license from Shutterstock for commercial purposes. Because the one thing is, both Amazonas and Coral are considered commercial publications because we charge for subscriptions, so at that point it's commercial use. And so, for example, a few days ago, somebody published some new Panopticus species, and they have a really nice picture, but we cannot just use that. We need permission from the author to use that image. And I've always made the experience, if I approach a scientist who just did something and said, we would like to cover your work, we would like to talk about it in the magazine, there are some, the vast majority are actually gung-ho about writing something themselves, because it adds one more publication to their list, even if it's not a peer-reviewed publication. It helps them reach a broader audience. And let's face it, who is interested in 2-inch long fish other than the scientist who works on it and some weirdos like us? Of other people have no interest, or it just doesn't cross their horizon that there is a 2-inch fish out there that's actually really cool. And so we are all about connecting scientists, and that comes from me being a scientist and a hobbyist at the same time. I want to make sure that we cover everything from the science side all the way to the legal side, all the way to the hobby side, and bring everybody together so that we can successfully keep animals, but also talk about, say, the revision of the genus Corydoras will be a big topic in the next few issues. I guarantee you that.
Be huge.
And it will be a huge learning thing, because everybody will need to go back. Wait a moment.
Arguably, it's currently blowing the internet up like crazy for anybody who actually cares about fish in glass boxes. For people that don't, they have no idea what's going on. But like the amount that I've seen people discussing it already in 24 hours, 36 hours, however long it's been, it's already a significant thing within the hobby. Yeah.
But it creates other problems that are unintended. I believe the Australian whitelist actually includes the genus Corydoras as a whole, meaning of the fish that you can import into Australia legally, Corydoras is mentioned as a whole genus.
Wow.
Well, what do you do now? Because suddenly you have all these resurrected genera. Yes, Scleromistax is there, and Brochis, which was there before, and Aspidoras. But now you have Osteogaster and a bunch of others. And now that's, for example, one of the critical things we have argued about when there was a whitelist proposal here in the US. Is that the problem with this is you need to be absolutely exact all the time, and every single time something gets revised, you need to update it. And rule number one is government and doing things timely. Those are usually two different things. And so I don't know what will happen in Australia with this, if they just keep sort of considering it Corydoras, or if the legal entities and the trade will get together to amend that. And I don't know what amendments on what level in Australia that would have to happen, because here in the US it's fairly simple. A whitelist would have immediately meant it would have to be on the species level, because the laws here are based on species. So you could not, for example, go and simply say, we're gonna allow all Corridoras in. You would have to literally list every single one of them, which means every single time a new one gets described, which happens about every 2 weeks, you would have to amend the list, which is, of course, simply from an administrative point of view, a real burden that I'm not sure. Now, granted, the people behind the whitelist, their goal was not to protect nature. Their goal was to simply prevent people from keeping animals. That's the ultimate goal. The big backers are crazy anti keeping animal in captivity folks. Nothing is about protecting nature. I mean, everybody in this round, and probably a vast majority of people listening to this, know that it doesn't matter if you protect a given species. If you don't protect the habitat the fish lives in nature, you may as well go home, because at that point it's like, you know, can we keep it in captivity for a while, maybe to re-wild it? In some cases, yes, that's entirely doable, but it's a heck of a lot less work not to let it die out in the first place.
Yeah.
So.
Silver Creek Wildlife has asked us, do you have any advice on archerfish breeding by any chance?
No, I don't. I've actually never kept archerfish. It's one of the many species that I've never kept, but I know that there have been successful breeding attempts made. I think there is one or two. I don't know if we covered those in the past. I know that at least in one of the German editions, maybe it was before the English edition happened, there was a breeding report, but I know they have been bred in captivity. But it's something I couldn't report firsthand or give any advice.
Okay. Back to the magazine. Can you share a bit of how the editorial process works? And in particular for me, like we've discussed, like scientific papers, when you've asked like scientists to write work, how do you kind of, I don't want to use the expression dumb it down, but make it easier for the general population to read? Something I find is that trying to read edited proper publications from scientists incredibly hard, and you try and find an easier version of it. So how do you work through that process for the layman, everyday fish keeper to understand?
Well, the good thing is that, say in the Amazonas team, both Courtney Tobler, Courtney is actually a ecologist, so she's a trained scientist, and Ann Whitman, our senior editorial advisor, she has been an editor for like 50 years in her main job, working for gardening magazines and so on. So she really knows something about how to edit language. But she's also a fish keeper all her life. So you have, on one hand, the main editor being a scientifically trained person who can assess the correctness of the content. And on the other hand, you have a hobbyist, and then all our reviewers, me included, anybody who looks at it. I unfortunately don't always have time to read every single article before it goes to press, simply because I'm busy doing the business side of it. But we have a fair amount of people going over it, and I just wrote in one of the newest Amazonas a treatise of the question: are there two different Zebra otocinclus, two different species? And there was a scientific paper about it, and I sort of dissected it and tried to make the arguments the authors present, and then essentially put my own personal opinion as well, when I said, well, based on what they present, my assumption is that these are two different populations where you have pretty much gene flow only in one direction, meaning there's some getting flushed down the river into the lower river populations, exactly what the genetic data suggests. And if you would sit on a sideline for the next, I don't know, million years or so, you would have two totally separate species if we could hang around that long. But when I wrote it and then send it in, and comes back with and says, this is written by a scientist for the scientific community. So she immediately put up some arguments and said, tone this down, take this out, explain this term. And that's how we try to make it readable for everybody, so that you go away with what we wanted to tell you. But on the other hand, I'm also one of the people who strongly believes we should be a little bit sort of pushing the envelope. I mean, the whole point about reading is that you learn something you didn't know before you started reading. And so sometimes, yes, we assume that somebody knows something, or then we, with references or with little text boxes explaining certain things, try to educate, because that is ultimately what the magazine is for, is that on one hand, it's fun to read. It's fun to, read about a travel piece and explore together with the authors, say, a faraway land, and learn something about the habitat out in nature. But at the same time, you also learn something about geography, zoology, botany, different habitat types. And, you don't need to, necessarily know a ton of scientific terms in order to read it. That's the goal. And if we use a scientific term, we always try to explain it so that you can still, should we have an author who writes something and we have to rewrite it fairly severely in order to make it digestible. But on the other hand, we have a significant amount of fish scientists are also hobbyists. That's the fun part. And so a lot of them actually do have really good handle on this. Is I'm writing for a scientific paper where every single word has to be measured and weighed properly, because you cannot be ambiguous in scientific writing. But then I write something that is for the hobby public. And of course, we have a ton of people that get our magazines that are scientists by themselves. So, I mean, when I look through the subscriber lists, I encounter a lot of ichthyologists, zoo directors, and people in the industry, and so on. So our readership is as diverse as the people writing for us. But the goal is really, both magazines are essentially made by aquarists for aquarists. That's the whole goal. It's not, we're not, producing 0815 content. Occasionally, with AI, we now get stuff where somebody is like, oh, I wrote this piece, and I look through it, and just the sentence structure and the way it's written is like, oh, this is like a vanilla version of Wikipedia. And then you figure out, I mean, the editors are kind of smart. We kind of agreed the first thing to check for something being accurately written is check the reputation of the author. Had a few where that person apparently does not exist. And then at that point, we just toss it, because we have good competition for good content. And I mean, we always try to encourage young people when they want to write, and we help them develop the writing skill to the first few drafts are sometimes not that interesting, and then you go back and try to coach them into, because of course for us it's important too that we develop the next generation of authors.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's something I didn't really think about. Like me as a shop trying to develop the next generation of fish keepers and hobbyists, because if the chain stops, the chain breaks, and it'll be the same as you. Once there's people not wanting to write, where do you get your things from? So you absolutely, you need to be developing new people coming through, which segues quite nicely into Ethan's question. I'm contemplating getting into article writing. What would be a good way to get on your radar?
Well, first of course is when people come first and say we would like to write for us, is make yourself familiar with the magazine. How do you do that? You read it. I mean, that's the first thing. Sometimes I have people is like, well, I don't know how to write this and so on. It's like, we have a whole guide on the website. Let's see. I'm sure I'm not clicking away from here, because that would be not a good idea. Let's see, but I'm opening up this thing. It's called, come on, load. Under about, when you go on aquaticmediapress.com, under about is terms and conditions and all that kind of thing, and it has a page called contributor guidelines. So there you get the whole shebang, what we pay and how it should be set up and what you agree to, etc. We don't do contracts. All about my word has a meaning I keep my word, and I expect the opposite to do the same sort of thing. Contracts are only useful to go back to what did you agree to, but it's impossible to enforce them one way or another anyway. I mean, unless you have a deep pocket with a lawyer. Internationally speaking, there's no chance. But so read the magazine, read the guidelines, then before you write a whole treatise of 10,000 words or something, get in contact with our editor. Address is also, email address is on the website, or me, and say, hey, I have an idea, I would like to write about this. And make a suggestion, and then depending what the suggestion is and what it covers, we might say, why don't you write a 10, 12 sentence paragraph what you have in mind, and then that often gives us an idea if it's covering the right thing, because it has to be the right audience. We have had proposals about dealing with stuff, say, that are more going into aquaculture or so, and I was like, yeah, it doesn't really, if 99.99% of our readers have absolutely zero interest in that, it's not the right magazine for publishing this particular paper. But I'm always on the side of, let's see what the idea is, what they want to do. And then the more you read, it's not just our magazines in general, the more you read, the better your writing gets. Because writing is a consequence of being able to read. And your style will improve the more you read, because over time you will get more used to how to express yourself the more you read. And obviously, when you want to talk about something, even when I start writing about something that I haven't written about in the past, I will check sources. And the critical thing is, when you check sources for information, is immediately write them down, because 3 days or 2 weeks later, you won't remember where you found this particular piece of information.
Correct.
And I always like to cite the people that gave me the information. I mean, there's even Wikipedia is actually a really good library. Some people argue about, this is like publicly done and biased and yada, yada, yada. I can tell you, looking at, say, molecular biology information on there, that stuff is, for the most part, actually correct and really, really well done. Now, what you should not do, which we have caught a few people, is copy paste all paragraphs out of Wikipedia into your work. That is not the right way of doing it. You can paraphrase something. You can say, okay, I'm talking about this particular site piece, and I just cite this. I mean, if a fish comes from Borneo, then you're going to write whatever blah, blah species comes from Borneo. Yeah, that you're going to find that in pretty much every treatise of the species, and there's no way around writing an 0815 sentence where the fish comes from. But then you should go into, how do you keep the fish? How do you breed it? Or what was the history behind how you got your own specimens? And sometimes it's fun. I mean, sometimes you read articles, people meet each other on a gas station somewhere in the middle of Germany and exchange fish almost like drug dealers. And that's, those kind of little stories are as fun. Or people go somewhere out in the wild and collect something and bring it home and keep it. And I always remind people, when you do this kind of stuff, is make sure that what you did is actually legal. Because nothing is dumber than writing up that you just trespassed somewhere into a reservation.
Yeah.
And walked away with an endangered species without a permit, and then put your name underneath. I mean, the thing is, law enforcement, we have seen this here in the US, they look at Facebook. They
Sure do.
look at Instagram. They look at scientific public or hobby publications. They're not dumb. I mean, and the not small part of the people in law enforcement when it comes to conservation are hobbyists themselves. So they're, you can set yourself up if you, do something illegal and then publish about it. And if you write for a scientific publication, you most often have to actually show permits that the specimens that you talk about were collected with permission of the country of origin. So the idea that you fly into the third world, grab something and fly home is no longer accepted. I mean, I'm not sure every magazine enforces it, every publication, but the vast majority of well-established publications will require that you show proper collection permits if you, for example, if you describe a new species. So, and that's the way it should be. I mean, we're past colonialisms, at least we think so.
We've had a question from Rebecca. Does Amazonius allow for citations, even shortened citations? Sorry, shorthand.
Very often what we do, especially in articles that have what do you call that, long references, we sometimes put them online because the real estate is limited. And so we encourage people to cite the sources, because that's the proper way of documenting that you actually have that particular piece of information from somewhere. Now, when she mentioned citation in terms of, do you verbatim take a bunch of sentences and put it in an article? Yes, we allow for that, as long as you cite the source, and then we put them into quotation marks, literally, like, so and so wrote, and then opening paragraph or quotation marks, put the information in close, and then put the reference in so that people can go and actually look at the original. And if we, for example, shorten it, then that's usually indicated with like ... at the beginning or the end, if we only use a part of it rather than say the whole paragraph. It all depends on the circumstances, but yes, we allow for citations as long as you're not filling half the article with citations, because at that point you're not the author. And we have had a few sort of instances when people lifted stuff that is under Creative Commons. So you can use it if you use it for, say, your aquarium club, or if you put it on your Facebook page or something like that, or on your home page or so. But since we're a commercial publication, most Creative Commons open access has a caveat, and it clearly says in most cases not for commercial use. And I mean, I always said, if we see something cool we want to cover, let's just go to the original authors and ask them if they want to work with us. Sometimes, I mean, most of the time they actually are delighted to do that. On occasion they say we don't have time, and then we ask for permission. Can we use some of the images here? And obviously we refer to the original publication where they were first published, and we thank the authors for being able to use the images. This is the proper way of doing it. I always say, copyright is there for a reason, and that is, if somebody has an image or somebody has written a text, he is legally the copyright owner, whether he protected the thing or not. But if you just lift it and reuse it without proper acknowledgement, that's just stealing. There's no other word for it.
Do you want to shoot, John?
I'm going to have to head off and leave the live stream a little bit early tonight, but it's been a pleasure talking to you, Stephan.
Absolutely.
I hope you enjoyed the remaining part of the live with everybody watching as well.
Right.
Before you shoot, John, for those that don't know, congratulations on your second grandchild a few days ago.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, congratulations, mate.
Thanks.
The next generation of fish keeper.
Yeah, absolutely. She's already got a fish tank in her room.
Cool. Thanks, mate.
Right, I'll catch up with you later. Have a good weekend. Lovely to meet you. Bye.
Yep. Bye. Let me quickly check. I'll have my daughter probably show up any moment. So.
Yep, cool. We can work on your time frame. I've got plenty more time, but if you're getting to that point where you need to do parenting thing, that's cool as well.
Right. Well, as soon as, so far I haven't gotten any notification they're on the way. I have a friend pick her up from summer camp because I'm here sitting with you, and so I had to figure out somebody else. I cannot just abandon my only child, otherwise my line ends right here. I have a slight problem with my wife tonight.
How do you encourage your readers sort of give feedback and to engage with the publication, to sort of know that you're hitting the mark for people? How does that kind of work?
Well, we get the interesting thing, feedback actually, for the most part, is positive. The kind of interesting thing is every single time we talk about glowfish, we get a lot of flack. And it's almost like a kind of a religious argument, where I say, well, it depends a little bit on how you look at man-made fish species. And being a geneticist myself by training, I actually know exactly how these things are made. And I have a very, what I would call a differentiated view on that, in that not every man-made fish has the same pros and cons. Like years ago, when the first flower horns popped up, there was a huge push against, all these are not real fish and yada yada yada. The same people who threw stones arguing about hybrids, it's an abomination or so, they keep swordtails and platies. Well, for people who don't know, all swordtails and platies in the trade are hybrids, because you get some of the colors and patterns only if you cross Xiphophorus helleri with Xiphophorus maculatus, meaning platy versus swordtail hybrids. That's how you get the color red, for example. And so nobody disputes that platies and swordtails are cool, or very few people. And obviously these are the staple in the trade. I mean, I would actually argue platies are a better beginner fish than guppies, despite the fact some people might disagree.
100%
on
board.
But the thing is, they're hybrids. They're just fine. They're not harming anybody, as long as you don't let them loose in a habitat they could survive. They're not harming anything or anybody, and the fish are just happily reproducing and happily living. And they're a great fish, especially for the kids, because they have live babies, which is so cool. I mean, the first time you have live young fish swimming around and you can raise them up, that, especially for kids, that is such an enormous observation, and that could keep them hooked. So if, for the purists who argue about no man-made fishes, I'm like, well, that's fine. You don't need to keep them, but you also don't necessarily tell everybody else that this is a bad idea. Now, to scroll back to the feedback, yes. So I think, run a newsletter of a few weeks ago where the first glow angelfish are now commercially available here in the US. Mm-hmm. In Europe, glowfish are completely illegal because it's a GMO organism. You can argue if that's good or bad. Purists will immediately say, "Oh, this is good that we have the rule." I'm not seeing the problem with a black skirt, albino black skirt tetra being pink. I mean, I don't necessarily like black skirt tetras. They're not that great when they get old in terms of looks in general.
Yeah, look droopy.
It's a robust aquarium fish, and fish actually could care less if they're pink, yellow, or blue, or black and white. They seem to do just fine. They breed. I know the breeder who bred the first glowfish, zebrafish, for the producer here in the US. Commercially established the strain. He's a good friend of mine. He's now retired, but I mean, if a young kid starts with fishing because they keep a bunch of glowfish in a tank with a special light, etc., and they get into the hobby, they maybe become a scientist, that's great. The vast majority of people eventually will graduate from this sort of specialty fish into what I call real fish. And when people argue about abominations, I was like, how about balloon mollies or tattooed fish? Or if we want to start throwing stones, let's start with those, because that is an abomination. I mean, the fish can barely swim properly, or especially tattooing, they're held on a wet towel and ink is injected. I mean, it's just torture. It has nothing to do with fish keeping. And if you want to keep a molly, why don't you just keep a regular black molly? And you don't need a white albino molly with a heart on it.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of things I don't like about the amount of fish or the type of fish that we can get in our availability, but I love the fact that we can't get tattooed fish. Right. We're not a part of that problem as a whole hobby here in New Zealand, which I think is fantastic.
Right. I mean, here in the US, they're legal, but I'm one of those things where I just say the trade, kind of like the monster fish that are hard to keep. just leave it.
don't
There's
do
enough other stuff out there that, and I understand, yes, it's at first glance, it's cool, you know, but then I was like, okay, so why don't you just get a bunch of different colored natural fish?
Mm.
And I mean, at that point, I'm like, go with the zebra fish or any of the other glowfish. At least the fish has a normal life expectancy and a normal life. I mean, as far as I know, in just looking at all the ones that have been made so far, none of them has aberrant behavior or is in any way incapacitated by having those fluorescent genes added to the genome. And that's always at the end of the day, when you're talking about animal welfare, which is part of our hobby too. I mean, we cannot just stick the head in the sand. It should be part of the discussion. And I'm like, let's not do this kind of stuff, because that really, really gets the people who are against animal captivity up in arms, and rightly so. I mean, it's I know that in Asia you see occasionally stingrays, which they call them bat rays. So they cut the front part of the disc out. And I guess if you do that when they're younger, the fish recovers from that injury, and then, but it's not the whole fish anymore. It's like, it's like, that is, you know, I'm laughing about this. Is actually a tragic thing. It's not necessarily.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Because you injure the fish doing this. And it may not be able to swim the way it's supposed to. And so just because we think it's cool, I mean, if you want to, you know, paint your motorbike in a different color or add some spoilers to your car, go ahead. But the Stingray is not your sports car.
No, it's a living animal that needs proper care. Like, I've got no issues with modifications that need to happen to things for medical reasons. Without doing this, this is going to happen in a negative way. That makes total sense.
Right.
But modifications purely for aesthetic reasons on animals that have no input is just horrific.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, obviously we keep tons of different animals for different purposes. And I mean, it's probably an endless discussion in the whole dog world about different breeds of dogs that cannot breathe and stuff like that, or hairless cats and other kind of things. And obviously there's a whole plethora of taste questions to start with. But at the end of the day, my threshold is what I call, can the animal actually behave totally normally? Can it live a normal life? Could it reproduce if given the right conditions, etc.? As long as these things are more or less fulfilled, then I can say I can live with it. And we actually published, probably now 3 years ago, maybe 4 even, a special issue, or it's not a special, it's just a regular Amazonas issue, Man-Made Fishes was the title. And I wrote one of the introductory pieces why we did this. And it was kind of interesting because my good friend Hans Evers, the original German editor, he was up in arms when I touched that topic, because he's a relative purist in that regard. And we have had long discussions about this. And I simply said, you know, if I get somebody to start fish keeping because of glowfish, then I have a hobbyist and not necessarily destroyed fish. But I clearly in that introductory piece dissected, I think I called it the good, the bad, the ugly, something like that, along the, you know, Western for many years ago. With the idea that not every man-made fish is the same, and actually, you know, saying why this, how this comes about, how that comes about, and how one should look at it in terms of you know, animal welfare. I mean, people could make the argument a simple albino as a man-made fish granted, most albinos go back to a natural mutation sometime.
So that just brings up what Rochelle asked. Yeah.
Yeah, if you breed enough fish, you will actually pretty much in every species sooner or later encounter some albinos. And some people just find them pretty ambiguous. There's a few, like hoplo cats. There's an albino of Hoplosternum. I think it's currently called Toracata. I'm not 100% sure. And that is actually a really cool fish because it has some blue tones in it and a bunch of other things. And it's a really neat fish. And other albinos are just dead ugly.
I'm the same. I like albino aratus. I think a really, really nice looking fish.
Yep.
There's a slight color tone through them, are lovely, and the snow white. I can't remember the scientific name for them. Again, a lovely white with an undertone of slight blue on it. So there are some nice ones, and then there are some dog ugly ones that you go, really, who would enjoy this fish?
Right.
And but that can be said with natural fish as well. You go, man, that is beautiful, and someone else go, ugh, that's ugly, but we're keeping them in our houses. As long as you're enjoying it and looking after it, that's all that really matters at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the kind of thing too. I mean, we can argue about taste, and we can argue all day long or all night long. And my attitude there is like, as long as it floats your boat, then go for it. And you pointed out, as long as you keep the animal in proper conditions, then there's nothing wrong. Of course, some people might argue, oh, the fish who has albino, he might be, blinded more by the light because there's no melanin in the retina keeping the light from going through. And I'm like, as far as I can see through all my life of over 40 years of fish keeping, I've not seen any weird behavior among albino fish. I've literally haven't. Now, I'm one of the people who thinks for the most part albinos is not my cup of tea. On the other hand, it's sometimes handy, especially in breeding tanks, to have a bunch of albino bristlenose in there to clean up. And the cool thing is they're easy to find when you need to move them around because they're bright. They stick out, and it's not a hard call to find them and move them from one tank to the other, which with the brown ones is a little bit more tedious because you have to search for them.
Correct. Yeah. Cool. All right. If we can we talk a little bit about your fish room and what you've got going on in there? Some of the species that you're currently keeping and spawning. If you want to have a wee discussion about that.
Yeah, I've actually in the last year or so bred a bunch of new tetra species. There's this big push out of the Brazilian Shield, where a lot of new tetras. Some were discovered, some were rediscovered, some have just recently been described, some still have no name. And we have bred, I don't know, a dozen or so, probably half a dozen of those were, as far as I know, I'm the first one having bred them. Now, when you're talking breeding Munchausia, Hyphosabricon, on Hemigrammas, they're all relatively the same to breed. So if you breed one Hyphosabricon, then breeding another one is not necessarily a huge achievement. But then on the other hand, there are species that other people have chewed on for a long time and not been able to breed. Sometimes it just depends on the specimens you have that it doesn't work. Sometimes you just try the wrong approach, because even if they belong into the same genus, they are not necessarily always, the triggers are not always the same. Especially something like Hyphosabricon, which is a huge sort of catch-all genus. There's probably, similar like Corridoras, it eventually will need to be broken up, but I don't think anybody out there currently has the stomach to do this because it's going to be a huge amount of work. trying to even if you can within the group can immediately make some, or within the genus you can make some groups where you, oh, these all look similar, they should probably be one group, or these are a separate group. But then there's a difference between actually just looking at them and say, oh, I can group these sort of on the overall look, but then to actually scientifically justify it is a totally different story. But yeah, so I breed those. I just bred a bunch of Petia species, which are the relatives of the black ruby barbs. I just got actually a nice batch of Petia pentazona, and those are true pentazona, because the vast majority of the 5 stripe barbs that are in the trade are hexazonas and not pentazonas. Difference is a spot under the dorsal, and that's again one of those things too. I was getting some fish from my favorite wholesaler, and my colleague said, hey, I just got some true pentazonas in, there's space in the box, do you want some? And I'm like, what do you mean by true pentazona? And it's like, oh, the ones that we usually get are hexazonas under the name pentazonas. And so I was like, oh, sure. So and, I have another, that's how I get to 180 some species in my fish room, is because
I get it. I understand.
And yeah, then I keep, I have tanks somewhere from 100 gallon, 120 gallons up to, or down to 5.5s. And I usually combine some sort of pleco with maybe a loach and either some barbs or tetras, depending on, I'm not strictly or religiously separating by origin. I'm more looking at what does the species require in terms of water conditions.
Yeah.
And I have very hard water here, so while I can keep most fish happily alive, you can't breed them in that. So I have to create RO water in order to breed them. And one of the sort of observations I have, and that's purely empirical, there's no scientific evidence, but I think if I condition fish just in tap water and then try to breed them in soft water, I get a lot of white eggs. And I think what it might be is that the eggs are sort of optimized to be in the water that the female is in, and then if you then move them to different water conditions, when they get laid there, that they might not. So in some cases where I had troubles with, you get hundreds of eggs and you have 5 babies, something is clearly not quite working.
Correct.
And so at that point, my thought process, okay, maybe I need to condition the parents already in softened water, so that the difference then going from the conditioning tank to the actual breeding setup is not as severe. It may not do anything to the parents. The parents might just, as long as you adapt them over half an hour or an hour, they do just fine with the change, but maybe the eggs are not optimal. And who knows if a lot of them, when you know what you're doing, if you condition your fish right, very often they breed the next day or the 48 hours later, and there's potentially not enough adaptation happening. So I do that. Then I've been working on breeding a lot of those little ottocinclodes types, because there's some really cool ones. And while some of them, you have babies show up in the tank as long as you have nothing eating them. The trick has always been, okay, I can make 20 babies over a time frame of 6 months, but that's not what I call breeding. That's just multiplying. Breeding is if you truly come with a plan or setup or something and say, okay, if I do this, then I have a fair chance of getting a significant amount of offspring. And so I've been playing around with that a bit. And in one case, it started with a chance observation of seeing eggs on leaves, dried leaves, and then I was like, I wonder if they're actually a leaf litter breeder. So they put it into essentially the leaf litter on the ground, and so I tried it separately again, and yeah, well, it worked. And now I have tried 3 different species, and it worked in all 3. So I think
you're on something.
That's and yeah, literally a friend of mine was just here, or I should say his mother was just here visiting on a trip, and he has a store in Southern Ohio, a really nice store, and she just picked up 50 of those ottocinclus to take. And it's not one of, it's the Paraguay, those little brown ottocinclus that are ghosting around in the scene for like 30 years. And yeah, I sent her home with 50 for his store, and yeah, I can make more. It's not a problem.
Cool. So just from this last 15 minutes, I've actually taken a little bit from this. When I'm spawning tetra, lots of eggs, no fry. I do what I would assume would be the normal way, keep them in tap water, breeding conditions, go to RO water, softer water, get the spawn. Never considered conditioning them in that water as well. So I will be having we play around with that and see if that changes my fates whatsoever. So yeah, cool. There's a little bit to take away from there, but also then the ottocinclus, a lot of people not only struggle to keep them alive, but then to keep them, to spawn them. So from what I took from that is you've got like a leaf litter on the bottom, almost like a sort of a mulmy type of thing with broken down, which is catappa leaves and oak leaves, for example, and then they spawn within that.
They stick them like Corridoras. They stick them literally onto the egg. They look exactly the same like Corridoras eggs.
Okay.
And the best is just freshly dried oak leaves. I mean, the leaves can be years old, that doesn't matter, but they need to be relatively fresh so they're still sturdy and robust. I mean, I just leave them in the tank. After a while they decay on their own, but whenever I try to breed them, I simply do a water change, a fairly big one, and in this case actually tap water, so pretty hard water, and then I just put in a big handful of dried oak leaves, and after a day or 2 they sink to the ground, and then they put them anywhere. They hang them on the thermometer, on the lift tube, on the outflow, on the glass, on suction cups, but they really like the leaves.
Okay.
So
I've never had a crack at them, but it's been on my. I wouldn't mind giving it a go purely because they come on and off availability at wholesale so much, and it'd be nice to have them constantly available. But in my mind, I assumed they would spawn similar to like a pleco in a cave or underneath a piece of wood in a cluster,
nope,
as opposed to a scatterer. Wow, fascinating.
They're really ottocinclus behave pretty much like Corys do when it comes to breeding. At least those 4 or 5 that I have had eggs and fried so far. Oddly enough, I have not tried breeding the regular ones that come in from Peru or Colombia. I've never tried with those. I mean, they're less on my radar. I tried the Paraguayan ones are super hard to get because the only importer that used to import fish from Paraguay here in the US doesn't import anymore from there. And so the only source where you can occasionally get them is going through Glaser in Europe. So it's a little more tedious, but I got a group in that came that way, and then now I have bred, and now I have like 5 or 6 groups. And I'm pretty sure if I actually take this protocol and we just set up a whole rack with it, I could literally make thousands of those. But I wanted to keep them. That was the most important thing, is not to lose them, because I think it was the 3rd attempt. I got some from a friend in Germany many years ago, and then kind of missed the beat, and then got some more before we moved here, and then lost them in the move. And then when I got the chance again a few years back, size of tank, anything. They will breed in a 5.5 and a 10. In my case, they're breeding in 15s because that's where they're in. But they breed in any size tank.
Do you have additional flow running through them or anything like that? Is there any triggers? You just condition them and then let them do their thing?
I mean, they get, one of the important things is I feed live baby brine shrimp to those guys every day, because I raise them anyway to feed all kinds of other fish, or hatch. let's not go. I mean, that's not really raising. No, I hatch brine shrimp every day, and so whatever is left at the end, I dump into the autosynclus tanks. And the baby ones you could pretty much raise on brine shrimp. They will eat brine shrimp right from the get-go. Now I also feed them. I have what I call a fry mix, which is a combination of about 20 ingredients that I mix together. Everything is ultra fine, from spirulina powder to what they call golden pearls. Some Japanese larval diets that were developed for the finfish industry, like super microscopic stuff is crazy expensive. They're like $60 a kilo. But yeah, when it's mixed together, it's like the ingredients, I think last time cost me $800
Wow.
to put it together. But I mean, at the end of the day, I'm interested in trying new things.
Yeah.
And it's my 0815 fry food. I feed it to blue eyes, rainbow fish, killifish, tetras, barbs, catfish babies. Everybody gets them, and that is really, yeah, what makes it easy to use. Which, given the fact that I travel quite often and either friends or my wife has to feed, I need to have something that it can be easily fed without having to go through like 15 different kinds of foods on the shelves. That my wife would kill me if she would have to do that.
Yeah. Cool. So we're pretty much getting close to the end of our time.
That's good, because I hear some noise outside, so it might get loud at any moment.
So we like to end our live streams with what we call the School of Six, which is Yep, we can do that. I hope everybody's enjoyed this. That was a phenomenal little bit of a tidbit there to do with the autosynclus breeding. I very much enjoyed that. My ears spiked up quite nicely, as well as that little bit of information regarding possibly conditioning tetras. So yeah, that's pretty fantastic. Cool. So yeah, we like to end our live streams with a quick School of Six, which is 6 very short answer questions. So first of all, if you're doing a coin toss, do you call heads or tails?
Tails.
Cool. Are you a tea or a coffee drinker?
Oh, I drink coffee, lots of it.
Are we alone in the universe?
No, but luckily we will never get to where everybody else is. For the sake of them, not us.
If you could have a meal with anybody, alive or dead, fictional or real, from any point in history, who would that be?
Charles Darwin.
Cool. Not the first person that said that. Paper, scissors.
Not the first one.
Paper, scissors, rocks. What is your first call?
Rocks.
Cool. And what is your unicorn fish, which is either to see in the wild, to photograph, to keep, to spawn? Is there one that's just eluded you in your time?
That's a tough one.
Sorry.
That's really tough too. Well, one thing that's down in the fish room that I would love to breed, it's Mancausia haikoi. Just because my good friend Hans has tried for 5 years and has not been successful. I would love to beat him to the punch.
Fair enough. And my last question for you is, where can people find you, find your business, and find your magazines? This was a free, shameless plug. Throw it all out there for everyone to know.
Well, if you go to aquaticmediapress.com or to SwissTropicals.com, you're going to find me, my contact details, and further information. I mean, if you Google Amazonas magazine or Coral magazine, you're going to find us too. So
cool. Thank you very much.
That's definitely something. I can help with lots of things, but don't forget, filters are just tools. We need filters to keep fish. Sometimes people ask me to talk a lot about filters, and I personally actually rather talk about fish.
Fair enough. Thank you very much for your time. It's greatly appreciated. I can assure you that I have had a lot of stuff moving around in my brain after this conversation. I know there's many people that have watched that has also found that as well. So I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And it's been fantastic having you.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for putting the word out that fish keeping is cool. We need more people like you.
Certainly is cool. All right, everybody. Thank you for watching. Have a good one, team. Happy fish keeping, and catch you later.
Yep. Thank you.